Alright, so I have a random thing on my mind that I just kind of thought of, that I always found a little bit strange, that I sort of wanted to point out. I've had Star Trek on my mind a lot lately, it's not a mystery why. It's probably because I've been reviewing season 1 episodes with Mr. Catman, which have been a lot of fun. But I've been just kind of ruminating about some things, and, about kind of the opinions of a lot of Star Trek fans. I don't even know. People still call them Trekkies. I'm not even sure if that's still a thing or not. But in the 90s, it definitely was. But yeah, there's some opinions that a lot of them seem to hold that seem to be so-called popular opinions. Things that a lot of Star Trek fans just seem to unanimously hate or love. Just it seems like the general take. There's some things out there that just people generally like or hate. If you're, one of the people that love Star Trek. And, that's just something that happens within any fan base. But there's a lot of people, and we sort of touched on this a little bit in our recordings, that are our age, they didn't grow up with the first Star Trek necessarily. They grew up with Star Trek The Next Generation. They grew up with Deep Space Nine. They grew up with the things that were around the 90s or even early 2000s, something like Enterprise. But they claim to like the original Star Trek. And I don't mean the movies, which I actually do think some of them are pretty good. Even just outside, just movies on their own. Like, I think they're decent movies. Not all of them, but, yeah, I might talk about those more later. But, I mean, they like the original series. Like, they actually like the show. And I've actually heard people my age who claim to love the original series. I mean, I knew a guy who... He was a fan of The Next Generation. He was a big fan of that. But he claimed he liked the original series more, which kind of blew my mind. And granted, it's not like I know a lot of Star Trek fans, so maybe his opinion is super out there and that just is not common at all. But I mean, I've even seen online, you kind of get a feel, and a feel for these things, even if you don't talk to lots of people in person. But it seems like there's a lot of people that love the original series, even though they didn't grow up with it. And to me, it's just aged so poorly that I find it baffling. Like, I honestly have a hard time comprehending it, because there have been a couple episodes that I was able to sit through that I thought, okay, in context, knowing when this came out, knowing this eventually turned into The Next Generation, I can kind of appreciate this episode... knowing the outcome of it, in a way. Knowing where the series, or the, IP went. Knowing where the franchise went. But a lot of the episodes, man, I've turned on, and I cannot sit through them. I mean, they're so hard to watch. Whether it's the special effects, which is fine, I can actually look past that. I've actually watched a lot of things, Pulp Fiction from the 50s, 60s, that had bad special effects. And I've seen past it because I thought the story or the plot of the writing was interesting. I mean, some of the Twilight Zone episodes, for instance, had not the best special effects. I've even watched The Outer Limits, which wasn't as good as the Twilight Zone. And that didn't have the best special effects. It actually had some really cheesy monster effects. But I thought it was interesting enough to watch and sit through. With Star Trek, it's a little harder for me. And... it just makes it, a little hard to appreciate some of the more serious storylines. But even beyond that, some of the writing, man, like even some of the way they treat other alien races are just, they're a little hard to take. It's a little stomach churning. And I find it a little baffling that so many people like it that didn't grow up with it. If you grew up with it, I understand. It's nostalgic. You grew up with it at a time that stuff, had a lot of new ideas that maybe wasn't being played around with at the time, and you can look back at it with fondness. I get it. I have things like that too from my childhood, where as an adult I can go, if I just watched this, I would think it was horrible. But as a kid, I thought it was great. And that's totally fair. But the thing I really don't get is when so many Star Trek fans hate season 1 of Star Trek The Next Generation, which is completely fair. That was not a good season. Thank God it had something like, because Star Trek was so well known by then and was so beloved. Thank God it had that name attached to it, because I don't know if it would have survived season 1 if it didn't. But we're all lucky that it did, and then it became the show that, is generally considered pretty good, even by today's standards. But some of those people that despise season 1 love the original series. And I can't really wrap my head around that, because some of the stuff that was so bad about season 1 was because it was sort of like the original series, and it was so cheesy, and it was so stomach churning, and it was a different time. It was like late 80s, and some of that stuff didn't really fly in the same way as it did, at the time when the original series came out. And it kind of confuses me a little bit, where I'm like, if anything, some of the worst episodes from season 1 are still somewhat better than some of the worst episodes from the original series. So I kind of can't wrap my head around that, why people have that opinion, how they can love the original series and then be like, oh God, but season 1 of The Next Generation was horrible. And like I said, I don't like the first season. I agree. So I in fact, even when I was a big fan of the original, or of The Next Generation, I thought season 1 was so bad, I couldn't really get through it. I would watch a couple episodes here or there, and it was hard to watch. When it was being played on TV, when it was the first season, which is really obvious to tell, you can kind of tell instantly from the way people are dressed. This is kind of like before it was available on streaming services. I would just kind of not watch it. Sometimes I'd leave it on, and then sometimes I'd regret it and end up turning it off. Sometimes I'd sit through the whole thing just because, I'd like the show, and I just thought, I should watch this. I should watch the first season and see where things, first started in the show. And I had a really hard time making it through. Eventually I didn't make it through. Eventually I did sit through the whole season when it was available on streaming services. But before that, I really had a hard time sitting through season 1 episode. But yeah, I guess I'm just kind of baffled on that. And maybe there's some reason for it. Maybe people that didn't grow up with the original series can say, no, but in my head, I can put it in the time period it came out. And so for me, I can kind of forgive it a little bit more. Maybe there's some reasoning like that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it's just because, I don't know, sometimes I get the vibe it's just because people online, everyone said Star Trek is awesome, but season 1 of The Next Generation sucks, so people just kind of repeated that, and they just sort of repeated that without even really realizing it's the same thing as the original series, as I see it. I mean, a lot of it's very similar. Some of the cringiness is very, it's cringy in a very similar fashion. So yeah, I was just randomly sitting here and I thought I'd record me saying that out loud, and maybe someone will post and be like, oh, here's why I like the original series, but not the first season of The Next Generation. And that's not going to happen because no one listens to this. But yeah, I just thought I'd ask that question to the internet out there. So, all right, man. I'll see ya.